Hello, welcome to the Deacon's Workbench. My name is Deacon Fran Valliere, and today we'll be restoring a century-old Christiansen workbench. This century-old workbench had served its owners well for many years, but as you can tell from this photo, it was thoroughly beat on, pounded on, carved on, and worked on. It quite frankly was ready for a long overdue restoration. This is the first of several photos I took during the restoration. This one was taken shortly after I had started the process, using a cabinet scraper to remove all the old shellac droppings and hot glue pot drippings and various other spatter from the bench top. But before I continue with explaining what I did to restore this workbench, I'd like to preface the project with a short history surrounding it. You see, this bench has a long sentimental story to it. More than a functional workbench, it is a keepsake for me. This bench was my old mentor's workbench, and his name was Ferenc G. Wohner. He was a refugee from the Hungarian Revolution in 1956, and his flight into exile, along with his brother and nephew and others, landed them in New York City. It all began with Ferenc and John's father, Ferenc Wohner, pictured here. The insert to the right, bottom right, is a photo of Ferenc's father in the furniture factory that he established in 1909 in the Budapest neighborhood of Budapest, Hungary. Ferenc told me that his dad was quite the successful entrepreneur, well known in the area. In fact, the other insert to the left is a photo of all his employees, who were not only townspeople, they were from the same Budapest neighborhood. His business was considered very high-tech at the time. All the machines were powered by one large electric motor, each machine being belt-driven from the one motor. I can imagine what OSHA would think of that setup. His two sons, Ferenc and John, the children that I'm familiar with, and I'm not sure if he had any other siblings, both worked for the family business. The communist takeover of Hungary took place right after World War II, and if you click on that link, you can see the history of that. Shortly thereafter, the communists confiscated all properties, including the Wohner family factory. Escaping with only the clothes on their back, they were able to make their way to America as refugees. John found work at the Bronstein Carving Company in New York City. I'm not sure if his brother Ferenc, my mentor, found work there as well, but it's altogether possible. When that factory closed, John started his own business, made successful by his son Robert, and eventually his grandsons, and in particular John, and can be seen at their website, wohners.com. My mentor, Ferenc, found his way from New York City to my hometown in Westerly, Rhode Island, where he opened a classical period furniture and cabinet making business. He and his brother John were very accomplished woodcarvers and furniture designers and builders. Vienna-educated masters with laurel wreath recognition. The workbench in the photo to the left, with my mentor carving a cabriole leg, is the same workbench I would eventually inherit upon Ferenc's death. I worked as an apprentice for Ferenc back in the late 1960s and early 1970s, and worked at the very bench that you see there that was already well used. This bench is a C. Christiansen cabinet maker's bench, as can be seen on the vise choke. C. Christiansen was a company located at 792 Grand Avenue in Chicago, Illinois, that built and sold these workbenches from the late 1800s to around 1940. and the creation and original sale of this particular workbench falls somewhere around 1920 to 1930. Unfortunately, I'm not a videographer, nor do I have that type of equipment. So shortly after I started the restoration, I started to take a few photos that I could use in a slideshow to depict all that I've done to restore this beautiful workbench. Here you'll notice that I already began the restoration process by using a cabinet scraper to remove the knotwood debris, as I explained earlier in this slideshow, from the top in order to avoid ruining a well-sharpened foreplane that I had. I eventually used a jointer plane and a foreplane to restore the top flatness without losing too much of the patina, and that's one of the reasons why I did no sanding on the top of the workbench. You can see that the backboard to the tool well was pretty banged up. That chisel holder mounted on the back was an addition to the bench at some point, I'm not sure when. I removed it and discarded it, seeing that it wasn't part of the original equipment. Then I removed that beat up backboard and replaced it with a beautiful piece of hard maple. Then came the process of disassembling the workbench down to the nuts and bolts and screws. It concerned me as to what might happen once I start disassembling, or what might be found while taking things apart. Both the face vise and the tail vise had mechanical issues. The front face vise, shown here, had one of its slides out of square and parallel. Luckily, the other one was square to the vise face in both directions, so I removed the misaligned slide and then refit that double mortise and tenon, re-glued it, and clamped it up overnight. And surprisingly, the next day, when I pulled the clamps off and used some squares, found out that the slide rail came out perfect. The tail vise had a different problem, but it was also with the rail slides. Also, there had been a retrofit at some point in the bench top's life to replace the top plate of the tail vise. The repaired top had warped and cupped over time, so that all needed to be straightened out as well. Here are some different views of the tail vise being renovated. By cleaning the gap caused by the warp and cup in the top board, then gluing veneer shims underneath it, and afterwards planing the top flat with the bench top, the cup in the board was fixed. With the cup in the board fixed and the slide rails reset, the tail vise was put aside until the bench was ready to be reassembled. Once the bench top was freed from the base, I was ready to disassemble the legs. You can see the years of caked on dust, spatter, and whatever that needed to be removed. Also, someone had reversed the lower rails facing the bolt and nut access holes to the outside. Simple enough to correct that issue. From here I set the bench top aside and disassembled the legs. All the bolts and nuts were wire brushed and then spray painted with automotive gloss black enamel. The two pieces of wood making up the 3-tier foot that you see in this photo are not really part of the original bench. I removed those and tossed them as well. My mentor was a very tall man who needed to raise the workbench, so he didn't have to crouch down while he was working at it. I also removed and trashed the shelf that was underneath that supported all that junk that you see in the photo. My junk. Yikes. It was never part of the original bench anyway. Unfortunately, at this point, I only took a few more pictures as I progressed in the restoration, so my explanation will have to be good enough. But then again, this was a labor of love and not meant to be a demonstration. The work on the base proceeded very nicely. However, the legs and cross rails were so badly crusted over, it needed a lot more than just a simple cleaning. They needed sanding. Once past the dirt and grime, though, I saved the sawdust created by the orbital sander for later use with glue, so that I could make a wood filler that would match. I eventually used the wood filler, Tight Bond 3, and the sawdust on the bench top to fill in two gaps that had occurred over time between the laminated maple boards that made up the bench top itself. The legs and base assembly were starting to really look nice, and with a little stain, were coming back to life again. I was getting close to staining and finishing the entire bench. I could see the light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak, and was getting excited about finishing things up. Unfortunately, I didn't take any more in-process photos. Sorry about that. Suffice it to say, after staining the entire bench and reassembling it, I made up a mixture of 1:1:1 beeswax, boiled linseed oil, and mineral spirits, and used that wax to hand buff the entire bench. Finished? Well, not quite yet. After reassembly, I decided to make a modern and custom addition to the bench. I made it movable with retractable wheels. In this photo, you can see the new piece of maple that I replaced the old backboard with. Not a great color match. I'll get around to changing that to a stain that closely matches the rest of the bench top. But this is a restoration for purposes of actually using it again as a usable and functional workbench, and not an antique restoration. With all the dog holes cleaned out, I'll be making new bench dogs with side springs to hold them at whatever height I place them at, all the way down to 0 height for no-show dogs. My plans are to eventually replace the single drawer that you see in this photo with a multi-drawer unit that will have 5 drawers altogether. At that time, I'll varnish the base and legs to preserve it from any moisture or dirt or grime. To the left are a few more photos of the completed rework that show a few more of the details. You can see the beautiful tail vise choke renewed, and the retractable wheels that I've added as a convenience are far more prominent in these pictures. With the original bench restored and ready to be put back into production, I decided to build the drawer module to fit underneath the bench top. The original drawer was okay, but it was not very practical. Big as it was, everything I wanted close by to the bench top was stacked on top of each other. This made it difficult to find things that I needed, especially the tools I rarely used. They would get stuck on the bottom, and I was constantly digging them out. I finally got around to building that drawer case for the 5 drawers. I used a cabinet-grade plywood and sized the cabinet to fit in between the bench legs and its cross rails. I used a good cabinet-grade plywood, partly for looks, mostly for durability. I also used a method that many modern cabinet makers use, pocket hole construction. That was new to me, and I was sort of hesitant at first and maybe a little adverse to using this method, considering that I was taught to dovetail joints. But I decided to approach this with an open mind, and to my surprise I discovered that this method has much value and made for a quicker yet adequate build. With the drawer case done, I had to now fabricate all the drawers themselves. Again, I used cabinet-grade plywood, some from scraps that I had from a previous build, some that I bought new, to build these drawers. 3/4 inch plywood for the sides, and 1/2-inch ply for the bottoms. This made up the 2 larger drawers that were to the right that would handle more of my heavier tools and supplies. I used 1/2-inch ply and 1/4-inch bottoms for the other 3 lighter duty drawers. With the drawer case now stained and finished, I mounted the case to the bench leg assembly and then began to install the drawers using 100-pound rated soft close drawer slides. Because this is a workbench to be used in production and my desire to get this restoration completed as soon as possible, I decided to use the less expensive lumber, plywood, and the pocket hole construction to complete the work. Mind you, I see nothing wrong with either, but my mentor, God rest his soul, would be giving me the look. Love you, Farrens. Anyway, when it came time to put a face on the drawers, I decided to use a much nicer hardwood, mahogany. I believe this was my mentor's favorite wood to work with. All edges on the drawer fronts were hand planed for a crisp, smoother finish rather than sanding. A cabinet scraper made the face front super smooth. With the drawer faces mounted, the project was really taking shape and started to look good. Once I mounted some appropriate drawer pulls, I pulled the drawer fronts back off to give them some color and finish. The workbench now looks a little better for the wear and is now back in production to be put to good use for shaping and carving all my furniture and cabinet components. You know, if you have an old beat-up workbench like this, don't let it end up in the dump. Take the time to refurbish it and bring it back to life. These workbenches depict over a century of woodworking. Preserve it for future generations. A big thanks and shout out to the Wohner family for bringing to the USA and to my life the wonderful world of woodworking and an invaluable timeless trade. I miss you, Farrens. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this short video.